Hello, my name is Pete Troilo with Devex. We're here at European Development Days in Brussels. I'm here with Dr. Bruce Byiers. He's a policy officer for the Euro Center for Development Policy Management. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I see that you guys are discussing several topics today and facilitating some sessions. I want to focus on two different items in our discussion. One is private sector engagement, and the other is private sector development.
Okay.
And I know your organization is engaged in both. So on the private sector engagement side, I mean, we hear this term, the acronym PPPs, and Europe Aid being very dedicated to sort of this movement, trying to make these things happen. In your experience on the ground in Africa and other places, how is this movement going, and what can we expect over the short to mid-term?
Good question. Well, I think what's interesting from our point of view, from ECDPM point of view and a kind of policy analysis, is that there's a big kind of upswelling and interest in this topic. So I think there have been what you could call PPPs going around for a long time. There's been lots of private sector engagement through the World Bank and the IFC and other development finance institutions. So these kind of things have been around, but they've been not below the radar, but much less focused on at the donor level, I would say. And the private sector was kind of seen as something that kind of goes on in the background, but we focus really on the social sectors, let's say. So what's been happening recently, which I think is interesting, is that it's been creeping up the agenda for a number of reasons, I think. More cynical reasons or skeptical reasons would be to do with the economic crisis, in a sense that, while aid budgets are getting squeezed, we need to make them go further. That there's competition, let's say, for European donors from the emerging powers. There's an economic crisis on in Europe, so we need employment and we need a way of actually engaging European firms in, or we could engage with European firms to engage in development, which would be this win-win situation. We'd be able to create jobs and up at the European level and also help them invest into especially into Africa, is my area, but into developing countries. So I think what's interesting is that because this is coming up further and further up the agenda, there are more and more questions being asked basically about what the implications of this are. I mean, the positive aspect of it is, of course, that there's a lot to learn from the private sector. That actually we've kind of struggled with pure aid to really achieve big development results, let's say. And even when we're talking about trying to promote the private sector within developing countries, there's been struggles there as well. So here, more what the private sector engagement agenda to us is about how the development processes can engage with these international investment processes and try and kind of maximize the benefit. So some of there's all sorts of trade-offs around this, and I think that's where, going forward, where some of the main issues are. I mean, one of the points that kept coming up in the panel today is about how do you identify the development impacts. And what's interesting is at a kind of formal level, you have some people from agencies saying, well, all we need to do is to measure the right amount of conditionality that we need. We calculate the amount of aid money to actually apply, and then the project gets off the ground. The question of how do you get to that point of understanding how much money is needed. There was a discussion earlier this morning also as well about sort of partnerships with Nestle or with Unilever, and saying, well, we provide 5 million euros and then they bring 5 million euros. And then there are questions about, well, is that the best use of the 5 million euros? Does Unilever and Nestle need 5 million euros to go and invest in a public-private partnership genuinely, or what is the role that 5 million is having? And I think from our point of view is to try and understand where those trade-offs are, and to try and understand from lessons from the experiences, certainly of the DFIs and other donors that have been doing this more and more, where are these trade-offs, and how can we best identify the things that need to be taken into account in the future. So I mean, it's going to be an ongoing agenda, that's for sure, but it'll be interesting to see, and also from the private sector side. From the private sector engaging with donors, in the donor world we talk a lot about sort of how to bring in the private sector. In some respects, there's a question, should we not be looking at the private sector and saying, what can the donor do to take that agenda forward? Maybe that's what's happening in the Nestle case, for example, but it's a different set of questions.
Right. Shared risks, shared rewards.
Well, so how do you share the risk precisely? Because I mean, a lot of the questions also in sort of formal public-private partnerships, where you're talking about sort of the contractual arrangements, then of course we're talking about the legal capacity to form the contract in the first place, to make sure that the risk stands in an agreeable balance, let's say. But then there's also enforcement afterwards. I mean, one of the pieces of work we've been doing, or that I was involved in Mozambique, was looking at the Maputo corridor. So there's a concession on the road that goes basically from Maputo into the Johannesburg area, and that's being run by a South African company, TRAC. Complaints from the Mozambican transporters associations that I spoke to were about the road quality wasn't being kept to the same standard on the Mozambican side as on the South African side. But then once you kind of scratched a little bit underneath, what it turned out was that the Mozambican government wasn't managing to uphold their side of the bargain in terms of raising prices. The tolls had been agreed that they would be increased every year, and ultimately that's a political question. It's very difficult, and so they're facing political pressure at home. They've entered into this deal, and then what happens then in terms of making sure that contract gets upheld? And actually often we don't hear much. We think more about the private sector being the ones kind of potentially ripping off the government or stacking the risk on the side of the government. But there are also examples where it's the other way. And it's hard perhaps to draw generalized lessons from that, but I think it's important to know or know about some of these specific cases because it helps in the policy discussion.
And these local governments have a real stake in the game.
They have a stake in the game, and for me, ultimately, is very political. Yeah. And you also mentioned we make a distinction between private sector development as kind of focusing on the domestic economy and how to promote domestic firms and domestic investment, and indeed how to link up with international firms. But the focus is much more kind of in the domestic policy environment. Sure. And when we're talking about private sector engagement, it's to try and separate that agenda from the sort of linking with international companies. But underlying it all is these political aspects. So why, up to now, given all that we know about the problems created by red tape and the lack of credit and we understand fairly well what some of the constraints are to many businesses operating in those countries. In order to cut through red tape, somebody needs to be willing to do it. And ultimately what you do is you upset the balance of interest. So, which is often just the case of certain sectors are going to suffer, other sectors are going to benefit. How does it come out? Maybe depends on their links politically or else, or how much lobbying they can do themselves in a kind of perfectly legitimate sense, but there's also kind of slightly more under the radar activity, let's say, where private sector political connections can also be very much a part of the story. Those people who are already operating in the private sector actually aren't necessarily interested in having more investment and more competition and more operators in the same sector, or those that are surviving have proved that they can survive in that environment. And I think on the international angle it's a bit the same. There's kind of there are real questions about in agriculture, for example, there's more and more work going on about how to link multinationals with the small operators. But some of the big initiatives that have been that look the most successful are being driven very much by multinational companies managing to engage with the local government for some more or less favourable conditions, and then sort of moving on to, on paper they're going to try and engage with these small holders, but how does that work ultimately, and where are the real sort of interests, and where are the common interests and where are the conflicting interests? Basically I think that's where the debate lies, I think.
Interesting. So we talked about private sector development just a little bit, so we have about 20 seconds. In your mind, what does Europe Aid do best when it comes to private sector development? How are they really driving this? 20 seconds.
That's a hard one. Yeah. European aid in general? Yeah. I think what we can do now is provide information. I think as soon as you can use some of the aid to kind of put people in touch with different markets, not necessarily pushing Dutch firms to link up with money through not necessarily Dutch firms with Dutch money linking with developing country companies, but perhaps putting it more of a broad pool, European money, promoting European firms and putting them in touch with these opportunities that are on the ground, and perhaps formalizing the kind of requirements there, just to try and ensure that that development impact remains a kind of a key underlying factor.
Right. Bruce, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.